BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Okay, some of you will be listening to this on Thursday, but I think listeners on the West Coast will still get a chance to hear this on Wednesday night. And thank you to everyone for your patience with the Black Box Online Radio schedules for the winter, but I'm hoping that everything is going to smooth out and I'll be able to upload all of the regular segments, Zodiac Monday, Ripper Wednesday, and Cooper Friday, and at their regularly scheduled times and coming out in the morning. I always like to upload in the morning. But thank you for tuning in to this episode, and I'm going to be discussing the Jack the Ripper suspect, William Henry Burry. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. Jack the Ripper is perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery, and there are countless suspects that have been mentioned. There's also a list of suspects that some people think are rather credible. William Henry Burry is a suspect that I've mentioned before on Black Box Online Radio. I talked about him on the short-lived Jack the Ripper report, which came out in 2023, and I thought that this was a particularly good opportunity to revisit him as a Jack the Ripper suspect and to provide the most basic introduction about William Henry Burry. If you were to just do a Google search, this is what you would find. William Henry Burry was born on May 25th of 1859 and passed away on April 24th of 1889. He had recently moved to Dundee from East London when he strangled his wife Ellen Elliott, a former prostitute, on February 4th of 1889. He inflicted extensive wounds to her abdomen after she was dead and packed the body into a trunk. Okay, so immediately there are some reasons why people would suspect him of being Jack the Ripper, and it's not only because of what you just heard there. If going off of memory with some of these points, in chalk around the building where Ellen Elliott was murdered, there was a series of writings that were written that implicated the killer in the Jack the Ripper case, that implicated the killer in the Whitechapel murders. But I do recall from doing the Jack the Ripper report in the past when it says that he inflicted extensive wounds to her abdomen after she was dead and packed the body into a trunk, that he also broke her legs. He actually broke the bones, and that was how he was able to fit her body into the trunk. All right, so immediately, William Henry Burry was born in 1859, and Jack the Ripper operated in 1888. Then we have May 25th here, so he would have been 29 years old during Jack the Ripper's time frame. And that's totally reasonable. I mean, absolutely. John Douglas even estimated that Jack the Ripper would have been around age 30, almost like as a median. And also, there are possible witness sightings of people who could have been the Ripper walking with some of the victims. And they are also estimated to have been either around the late 20s or early 30s, so maybe even mid-30s. So all of that is totally reasonable. And I do want to point out that no matter what, before we say anything further, William Henry Burry is different than a lot of Jack the Ripper suspects out there because, as you just heard, he is indeed a convicted murderer. He did indeed murder his wife. So when people are proposing suspects like Lewis Carroll and Edgar Degas and some of these other individuals who might not even be that famous, if we're going to be talking about Scotland in this episode, which we will, how about somebody like the priest John George Gibson, who, well, maybe these men that I just listed off didn't actually murder anybody in their lifetime. But with William Henry Burry, he is indeed a convicted murderer. Now, there are a couple reasons for choosing to do this episode today here on Black Box Online Radio's Ripper Wednesday. Firstly, I would like to just give a shout out to all of you guys who have been sharing things in the comments section. And I wanted to respond to a very particular comment about William Henry Burry as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And I think the first person to respond to my old Jack the Ripper report was Jay, also known as JB, and he said something to the effect of, okay, maybe William Henry Burry was not Jack the Ripper, but he was a Jack the Ripper copycat because of the chalk messages that connected him to the Jack the Ripper case. I think it was Jay, so if that was you, shout out going your way. But we had a comment come in on last week's Ripper Wednesday episode from James Corlett, who says, Ned, nobody will ever be able to find Jack. Nobody. There are 11 murders that make up the Whitechapel murders. 2 before McNaughton says he killed the 5 women, and 4 after Mary Kelly, which are flippantly called copycat murders. If you take into consideration the time period in which the canonical 5 victims were murdered, 13 weeks, with the press and the people mostly convinced that the murderer was one man, but most of all W.E. Baxter, who went out of his way to promote the one-killer maniac who was given the name JTR or Jack the Ripper. In reality, there are more differences in the ways that the canonical 5 were killed than similarities. In my opinion, Jack cannot be found. Not one man or woman can claim the title. A good example of this is William Henry Bury, who I believe went to Scotland having already decided to kill his wife and a chance at playing Jack because he likely had killed in Whitechapel, and knowing the Scottish courts have a third option in a verdict called not proven, he wanted to be seen as Jack, hence writing a message that Jack the Ripper is behind the door, which he could have scrubbed off, and the way he murdered his wife before gives himself up. At a retrial not long back, he was found not proven in the murder of his wife, but guilty of being Jack the Ripper. Basically, in the end, the murders were committed by 3 different killers, perhaps 3 being by the same hand. Okay, so this is talking about not only the murders that have been attributed to Jack the Ripper and what we call the canonical crimes or the Autumn of Terror, but yes, of course, the Whitechapel murders begin in the spring of 1888 with the murder of Emma Smith, and they go all the way to 1891 with the murder of Francis Coles. But let's look at this stuff that is relevant to William Henry Bury. And once again, thank you to James Corlett for this comment. And anybody can share what they think about Jack the Ripper in the comment section down below. And you can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And feel free to download this program on Spotify under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. But as far as William Henry Bury and the murder of his wife Ellen Elliott, let's look right here. It's also saying that after the murder of his wife, he places her body into the trunk, breaks her legs, and somebody wrote this message on the building saying that Jack the Ripper is behind the door. Now, this was written in chalk, and there's also a message that was written after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, one of Jack the Ripper's victims, on September 30th of 1888, that was written that said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." That was written in chalk. So is this something that the Ripper is doing? Is this evidence of William Henry Bury's guilt? It's a similarity all the same. I will give it that. But as far as his actual implications, maybe James Corlett is completely onto something there when he says that this could be someone was planning to murder his wife, and he set this up because he thought that he could get away with it at the trial and also blame it on Jack the Ripper and set this thing up where it was all a cleverly devised scheme, but not too clever because William Henry Bury was indeed convicted. Another thing that I wanted to do for this episode of Ripper Wednesday was to look at the book The Trial of Jack the Ripper by Ewan McPherson. And so the subtitle of it is The Case of William Bury, 1859 to 1889. And there is just an introduction that I will read from the book. And often before I buy a true crime book, I like to do the whole free sample thing on Amazon. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you here. A shocking and brutal murder had taken place in the city in February of that year, and the words, "Jack the Ripper is at the back of the store," were found written in chalk on a door at the scene of the crime. When he was arrested, the accused, William Henry Bury, admitted that he was afraid that he would be arrested as Jack the Ripper. The police investigation uncovered some disturbing details. William Bury was a small, dark-haired man who was known to have been violent towards women. He had been born and brought up in the Midlands, but had moved to the East End of London in 1887, and it says the late autumn of 1887. On January 20th of 1889, he and his wife traveled by boat to Dundee. This meant that he had arrived in London before the start of Jack the Ripper's murders and had left around the same time that they ceased. Could this be a coincidence? I'll completely admit this. These are strong points implicating him in the Ripper case. These are strong points that are in favor of him being Jack the Ripper. He might not be the strongest Ripper suspect ever, but ultimately, I think that these are reasonable points of consideration. I mean, somebody shows up right before the Autumn of Terror, or the very least 1 year before the Autumn of Terror, and as they are leaving, the murders stop. And to be very clear, I'm not completely convinced that any of the post-canonical crimes were committed by Jack the Ripper. Could this be a coincidence, people wondered? Could it also be a coincidence that the murder in Dundee carried all the hallmarks of Jack the Ripper? I mean, I wish I hadn't gargled that sentence right there, so I'm going to read it again. Could it also be a coincidence that the murder in Dundee carried all the hallmarks of a Ripper murder? Oh, wait, excuse me. Think about everything that you have just heard from me in this episode talking about the murder of his wife, Ellen Elliott. Number one, the name Jack the Ripper was left at the crime scene. Well, when did the Ripper do that? I just told you that the message written after the murder of Catherine Eddowes said the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. That's called the Goulston Street Graffito. When on earth did Jack the Ripper ever use his name at the crime scene? The name Jack the Ripper is found on the Dear Boss letter, and Saucy Jackie is found on the postcard, and even perhaps one of the most famous Ripper letters, the From Hell letter, does not even say Jack the Ripper. So, I mean, more importantly, though, the name Jack the Ripper comes from the letters, not from any graffito that was written at the crime scene. So that's something that is completely different. Number two, there is an effort to conceal the body. This is something that Jack the Ripper just simply did not do. I mean, the first victim was Polly Nichols, who was murdered outdoors. Same with Annie Chapman, same with Liz Stride, same with Catherine Eddowes. These women were murdered outside. And the Ripper certainly didn't try to drag their bodies somewhere and place them into a box. No, not even close. And even with the murder of Mary Kelly on November 9th of 1888, she was extensively mutilated, but during that time frame, the Ripper certainly didn't try to place her body into any type of box or trunk or anything of the sort, let alone breaking the legs of the victims. So what do you mean this carries all the hallmarks of a Jack the Ripper crime? In fact, I think that this entire crime scene with the murder of Ellen Elliott from 1889 is way different. I'm just noticing so many differences. I'm noticing more differences than similarities. And that's just my take on the subject. And as I said, I spoke when I was reading the sentence for the first time, even though I have previewed this material, because I think I get a little bit hyped up on this when people are just like, oh yeah, look at these two crimes. They're absolutely the same. They're completely identical. Yeah, no, but they're not. In the month before the trial of William Henry Bury, the local newspapers in Dundee began to run sensational stories linking the accused with the notorious Whitechapel murders. Well, this also doesn't really mean anything if the newspapers are going to say that there's some type of connection between this possible suspect and the Whitechapel murders. And I don't think Ewan McPherson is even stating that that's a piece of evidence. This is just pointing out that, yeah, okay, this is a fact. This is what the newspaper said. This is what they did. But I'm just going to share this with you. I'm going to share this with you. That's not evidence. Who really cares what the sensational newspapers want to say? They want to sell newspapers, and they're going to use any opportunity they have to say that there was a Jack the Ripper link some way, somehow. And they've been doing this for 136 years. I mean, this goes well beyond 1889 and William Henry Bury. I mean, how about in 1894 when they have the Sun saying that Jack the Ripper was Thomas Cutbush? How about even into the 1950s when they're talking about the death of a con man in Australia named Andrew John Gibson? And like, was he Jack the Ripper? I mean, this stuff happens all the time. I don't think it's evidence. I'm not impressed by it. And this book is not arguing that it is evidence. It's just, I'm just sharing that with you guys. So, there was a trial for William Henry Bury after the murder of his wife. And when the trial opened to a packed court, many in the public gallery were wondering if the man standing in the dock was none other than Jack the Ripper himself. I mean, in terms of profiling, William Henry Bury does match some of these points, but let's just keep going with some of the discussions here in the book. For decades, the rumors circulated in Dundee that Jack the Ripper had been hanged in the city, and that he was such a brazen killer that he played cards with his friends on the box which he had used to pack the body. In 1988, writing for the Scots magazine, I investigated the case, this is Ewan McPherson talking, and published an article in Scots magazine. My article came to the attention of Paul Begg, Martin Fido, and Keith Skinner, who were compiling the book The Jack the Ripper A to Z, which came out in 1991. For the first time, William Bury was listed as a suspect, and I was credited as the researcher. This was how the story of William Bury came into the public domain. A story can be passed down through the generations by word of mouth in good faith, but distortions inevitably creep in. Oh yes, we're going to see this with the Ripper more than any of the other cases, and I follow on Black Box Online Radio. We see it a little bit with the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper, and those are the stories that I talk about on Mondays and Fridays, respectively. For example, I mean, even with the D.B. Cooper case, you'll see lots of illustrations of D.B. Cooper wearing a black suit when he is jumping out of the airplane, but in all reality, it's most likely that D.B. Cooper was wearing a brown suit or a rust-colored suit, even though he wore a black tie. That's a very mundane example, but this is just showing how the details get altered by publicized and mainstream sources. But back to the book here. So it does not help when files which were held about the case were closed for 100 years. This book is an attempt to recreate the case using contemporary evidence and files which were not available when I wrote the article for Scots magazine. Although it has been years since the Whitechapel Killer ripped the life from 5 victims, when I was born, a mere 36 years had elapsed since the commission of the crimes, and it is probable that he, Jack the Ripper, was still alive when I was born. Let's see, 36 years, I mean, that means we're going to go probably to 1925, is that it? I do not know any math, so 30 years would be to be 1918, I think, and then we would be going up until 1924 thereabouts. Maybe it's 1934. I wish I knew math. Ever since I at the age of 11, paid my friend a visit in Whitechapel just in time to catch the fading shades of horror in the eyes of the aging EastEnders who had actually witnessed the awful events of 1888. I have watched for the past 70 years as the long procession of suspects has been literally booked. Although there have been 3-penny pamphlets written, such as The Whitechapel Horrors, being an authentic account of the Jack the Ripper murders that was published by Daisy Bank Printing and Publishing, its author, Tom Robinson, an old-style journalist, beyond reporting that a policeman on the beat at the time believed that Jack the Ripper was a foreign sailor, hazards no guess as to the identity of the killer. And I can only guess that that foreign sailor is an individual named Carl Feichenbaum. But in this episode, I want to talk more about William Henry Bury, the murder that was committed in 1889, and Bury's involvement in the Ripper case. And of course, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below if there are any Jack the Ripper suspects, as well as stories and possible crimes that you would like discussed here on Ripper Wednesday. Let's look at a different section here in the book by Ewan McPherson. 62-year-old Lieutenant James Parr was the senior officer at Central Park in Dundee on Sunday, the 10th of February, 1889. Born in Ireland in 1826, he had started out as a weaver before joining the Dundee Burgh Police in 1850. The police may have been his second choice, but this former failed weaver had shown a natural aptitude for the career. At 6:50 p.m., a short bearded man walked into the police station and asked Parr for a private interview. The man was 5 feet 3 inches tall and was under 10 stone in weight. When he took off his hat, he revealed a dark head of hair, but he would not look into the eyes of Parr as he spoke. On duty with Lieutenant Parr was Constable William McKay, who was the acting bar officer. Parr left McKay in charge of the police station and took the man into a private room. The man, who still had not given his name, began to make his statement, and he stated that he and his wife had been drinking heavily on the night of February 4th of 1889. By late evening he was so overcome with liquor that he did not know what time he had gone to bed. As the man continued, his statement became more and more bizarre. The next morning he said that he had awoken at about 10 a.m., and was surprised that his wife was not in bed with him. On looking around the apartment, he saw her lying on the floor. He called to her, but had no response. Getting up and going over to her, he was startled to find out that she was lying dead on the floor, with a rope around her neck. The man did not attempt to summon a doctor. Instead, after looking at the body for a minute or two, he was seized with a mad impulse, lifting a large knife nearby and plunging it into her abdomen several times. Sometime after this, he said that he became afraid that he would be arrested as Jack the Ripper. In his panic, he concealed the body into a large box. Okay, so now you've heard about the murder of Ellen Elliott, and firstly, rest in peace to her. No matter what happened to her in her personal life, and no matter what she did in her personal life, I do not believe that she deserved to be murdered and mutilated in that way. When I hear a story like that, immediately I think, yeah, this person's making it up. This person murdered her, and they have concocted some type of cockamamie story about how and why they did it, because it's an attempt at getting off the hook. It's an attempt at coming forward and hiding in plain sight. Perhaps it's a sociopathic and narcissistic trait when they're trying to just talk their way out of it. But let alone that William Henry Bury appears to be the man who brought himself forward. I mean, you just heard that segment from Ewan McPherson's book, The Trial of Jack the Ripper, where he walks into the police station and he is offering this information. And this could all tie back to James Corlett's original comment when he's just saying that this guy murdered his wife and he was trying to get not an innocent or guilty verdict, but a not proven verdict. So he had some type of plan to get out of the legal trouble and the consequences that he was facing. But as far as everything that you have just heard here, you perhaps can already tell where I'm going to stand when it comes to interpreting the evidence. Number one, did William Henry Bury murder his wife? Yes, I think so. Number two, did he actually tell the truth when he said he just saw her dead and then he had the sudden urge to plunge the knife into her abdomen? I don't think so. I mean, that sounds like someone who murdered his wife. They got into a fight, it went too far, something escalated, and he lost control in a rage and murdered her, and then started thinking about his next moves. Then the next point is, was he Jack the Ripper? As I said, there are some strong points, let alone the fact that his wife, Ellen Elliott, was a former prostitute, and the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper also had similar professions and occupations. I mean, that alone shows that there is some type of just similarity in victim profiling, let's say that. Partnered with the fact that he's of an appropriate age, he was in Whitechapel at the time, he arrives and then the murders start, and then he leaves when the murders stop. I mean, all of that stuff are strong points of consideration. However, that is just talking about his physical characteristics. That's just talking about him as an age-appropriate male who was in the area, who also goes on to commit another crime. There are going to be other murderers out there than just Jack the Ripper. And I think that this is just leading more and more toward the point of him being a Ripper copycat because of all of the reasons that I've laid out. This is just someone who committed a murder in an extremely different way. It's almost as if he was trying to commit the murder as Jack the Ripper. He's trying to commit the murder and make people think that he was Jack the Ripper, but he didn't know about all the specifics. He didn't know exactly how it was done, so it came across as a piss-poor imitation. And it's just that, it's an imitation. Someone who's trying to make the crime look like Jack the Ripper, but they didn't do a very good job. It was actually a very sloppy job. I mean, and also, as I've brought up multiple differences between his crime and the Ripper's murders. I mean, the concealing of the body as well as the message that's written in chalk implicating Jack the Ripper. But those aren't the only things. I mean, I will completely admit that people can commit different crimes for different reasons, but I don't really think that's the case with William Henry Bury. So he is just falling on the ranks of being a suspect in my own personal opinion. But I would love to know what you think about William Henry Bury. I would love to know if you have any observations about the murder of Ellen Elliott and how it was committed. And also, I would love to know what you think of, do you think he was guilty? I mean, I think that he was guilty. As I said, I think he made up the whole story. I don't know what was in his mind or in his heart and when he actually decided to murder her, but perhaps I could look more at Ewan McPherson's book, The Trial of Jack the Ripper. And at this time, I'm just going to turn it over to you guys and invite you one more time to give your feedback in the comments section down below. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ripper Wednesday. You can put anything you want in the comments, but you can also send larger thanks to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. I am your host, Blackbox Ned, and I will see you on Friday talking about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.